She wore her veteran's uniform to honor her late husband. But airport security pulled her aside, accusing her of stolen valor. Phones were out. No one defended her. Then a voice from the back whispered, "She trained my father." The officer's face dropped, because her ID wasn't just real, it was classified. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The polished marble floor of Terminal C gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights, reflecting the shuffle of designer sneakers, rolling suitcases, and boot heels. A crowd murmured in every direction, announcements over the PA system, hurried phone calls, kids whining, and the subtle sigh of people waiting to go somewhere else. Amid this swirl of modern transit, Miss Lucille Jackson moved slowly, each step deliberate, the rhythm of a body weathered by history. She wore a faded olive green military uniform. Not a replica, not a costume, an original. The hem frayed slightly, the brass buttons dulled from decades of polish, and the medals, what few remained, clung to her chest like tired survivors. A battered duffel bag hung from her shoulder. Her back, though bent, held a strange dignity, as if the very weight of the country rested on her spine. People stared, not out of awe but confusion. Whispers chased her like cold wind. "Is that a Halloween thing? Looks like she stole it from a museum." "No way she served." She heard them. Of course she did. Lucille had walked into rooms all her life where her presence was questioned before her name was even spoken. She knew the cadence of disbelief, knew the sting of it. At Gate 14, a cluster of Gen Z influencers, huddled together, phones already in hand. They were loud, camera-ready, hungry for content. One of them, a boy no older than 20, nudged his friend. "Yo, check this out. Granny's trying to cosplay as a soldier. That uniform got rust on it."
Laughter erupted.
Another girl flipped her camera toward Lucille and hit record.
"Okay.
"So we're at the airport and just saw Harriet Tubman's great-aunt reporting for duty. Was that uniform from the Civil War or what?" the boy shouted, loud enough to draw glances. They burst into more laughter. Not the innocent kind. The kind meant to wound. The kind that clung to the air and stung like acid. Lucille said nothing. Her lips stayed shut. Her eyes stared forward, but her right hand trembled, a small silent quake betraying the thunderstorm inside her. People nearby noticed. They looked. And then they looked away. The TSA agent at the checkpoint stared at his monitor. A man in a suit beside the influencers chuckled nervously, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to say a word. A woman pushing a stroller pulled her child a little closer and walked on. Only the janitor, an older Hispanic man polishing a trash bin nearby, paused. His eyes met Lucille's for a moment. Something passed between them. A recognition, maybe. Pain, surely. But he said nothing. He returned to his work, his mop gliding silently across a spill that didn't matter. Lucille reached into her duffel bag and pulled out a boarding pass. Her hand still shaking. She tried to tuck it into her breast pocket, but missed. It slipped to the floor. The boy filming didn't hesitate. He swooped in, phone first. "Uh-oh, soldier down. We got a code elder." Another round of shrieking laughter. They were live now, streaming to thousands. Comments rolled in. "Who let this woman out? Stealing valor, lol. Someone call her nursing home." Lucille bent slowly to retrieve the pass. As she rose, her sleeve shifted just enough to reveal the unit tag beneath her shoulder, an insignia stitched in the threadbare fabric. The laughter didn't stop, but someone had. Just 10 feet away, a man in full military dress uniform paused mid-stride. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. His presence was quiet, but it carried weight, years of command etched into his posture, his every movement trained and deliberate. Brigadier General Granger had been on his way to Gate 17 for a defense summit in D.C. When he caught sight of the tag, his eyes narrowed. His footsteps halted. The tag read, 3 Sutter. He blinked once, twice. That wasn't just any unit. That was the original Tuskegee Airmen. Black pilots who fought in World War II when the country still debated whether men like them were even capable of flight, much less honor. The first black military aviators in the U.S. Armed forces, heroes, legends, and now nearly all gone. He looked at the woman in the faded uniform again. At the medals clinging stubbornly to her chest. At the insult bleeding from the smirks and giggles still echoing behind her. And then Elias Granger, Combat veteran, Bronze Star recipient, and son of a man who grew up idolizing those very airmen, stepped forward. He didn't blink. He didn't smile. He simply stared at the insignia, his breath catching in his throat. Lucille didn't see him at first. Her eyes were fixed ahead. But she felt the sudden quiet, the shift in the air. The influencers were still filming, still talking, but Elias's presence silenced everyone around him. His voice, when it came, was low, unshaken, laced with disbelief. "Ma'am, where did you get that uniform?" Lucille turned. For the first time in the terminal, someone looked her in the eyes without ridicule. Her lips parted, dry and cracked. She spoke in a voice that had not been used publicly in years. "I earned it." Elias's eyes flicked back to the tag, the medals, the age in her eyes. She wasn't lying. And then he froze. There, on her left sleeve, was a campaign ribbon he hadn't seen in over 30 years. A ribbon awarded only to those who served on classified communications missions during Vietnam. His breath caught. This wasn't just a uniform. It was a testimony. He turned slowly, facing the crowd that had just moments ago laughed with open mouths and raised phones. His jaw clenched. His next words were laced with fury. "Do you even know who you're mocking?" No one responded. The camera was still recording, but the silence was louder now. Lucille's hand, still trembling, moved slightly toward her chest. The edge of her dog tags peeked out from beneath the fabric. But Elias wasn't looking at them anymore. He was focused on something else entirely. Something he hadn't expected to see. A faint faded stamp above her unit patch, barely legible now, bore a sequence of numbers and letters he'd only seen on declassified war files. He leaned closer, squinting to confirm.
His eyes widened.
It wasn't just the three, it was a subgroup that never officially existed. And Elias Granger had just realized. He was standing in front of a ghost the government had spent 50 years trying to forget. Brigadier General Elias Granger stood stiff, the chaos of Terminal C fading into a strange silence around him. His eyes stayed locked on the insignia stitched into Lucille Jackson's shoulder, but his mind was 1,000 miles away, swallowed by recognition and memory. The 32nd Fighter Group, not just a number, not just a squadron. To most passers-by, it was an obscure designation, something barely touched in history books. But to Elias, it was sacred. His father, Harold Granger, a mechanic turned civil rights attorney, had spent his life idolizing the Tuskegee Airmen. Elias had grown up hearing stories, not bedtime tales, but real-life legends, whispered in reverence over the dinner table. Men who flew not only against German fighter planes, but against American doubt. Men who painted their planes with red tails, not for decoration, but because the military refused to integrate their support systems. They fought 2 wars, one abroad, one at home, and they won neither medals nor full recognition in their own time. So when Elias saw that unit tag on the sleeve of an elderly black woman being mocked by children with ring lights and smartphones, it wasn't just jarring, it was soul-rattling. He leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, may I ask where you served?" Lucille didn't answer. Her lips pressed together, the lines around them tightening. Her eyes didn't shift. If she was afraid, she didn't show it. If she was angry, she buried it deep. Elias read the pause not as defiance but as calculation. The silence of someone used to being misjudged, who knew that sometimes truth was a landmine. The group of teens behind them snickered again. One girl, holding her phone at chest level, said just loud enough, "What's he gonna do, salute her? Is this a skit?" Another added, "I swear old people will do anything for attention. Bet she bought that uniform at a thrift store." Elias turned slowly, his face unreadable. But his eyes burned. "You just insulted royalty," he said calmly. "Military royalty." That stopped them. They blinked confused. Royalty? Was this some kind of cosplay reference? He continued, this time a bit louder, addressing not just the teens but the growing circle of curious travelers who had started watching, recording, listening. "That tag on her uniform. It belongs to the 302nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen, first black pilots in U.S. military history. They flew during World War II, while this country still segregated its water fountain. They were warriors and patriots when it was illegal for them to sit in the same bus row as the people they protected." The terminal grew still. "You laugh at her because her uniform looks old. Because it's worn. But that wear? That's history. That's pain. That's what happens when a uniform has to outlast the country it defended. His voice cracked slightly. And you're all too young to know what it cost people like her just to put that uniform on. Lucille flinched. Just barely. But enough. Elias saw it. He softened. Ma'am, he said, quieter now. I'm sorry if I startled you. I've just never seen anyone from that unit still alive, let alone standing in front of me. Still no answer. But Lucille's breathing had changed. Faster. Shallower. He noticed her hand drifting to her left pocket. For a second he wondered if she was reaching for ID. Maybe an old military badge. Instead she pulled out a weathered photograph, creases worn into it, like fault lines. She held it out to him.
Elias took it.
It was black and white, faded at the edges, but the image was unmistakable. A row of soldiers, all black, standing beside a plane with a red tail. And there she was, younger, eyes clearer, smile intact, standing tall at the far left in full uniform. He looked up. Her face now was older, lined with sorrow, but the eyes were the same. You really were there, he murmured. Lucille nodded once. A small, almost imperceptible gesture, the kind you make when you're too tired to argue, but unwilling to be doubted. Elias turned to the teens. One of them had stopped recording. The others hadn't. You need to understand something, he said. What you just did, mocking her, filming her, treating her like she's a joke, isn't just rude. It's dangerous. That kind of ignorance erases people. It buries legacies. It's the same mindset that told women like her they couldn't serve, and when they did, pretended they never had. The girl with the phone lowered her gaze. The boy who made the Civil War joke stepped back, awkwardly. Elias took a breath and turned to Lucille again. I don't mean to press. I really don't. But I've never seen that specific insignia under the 302nd. It's not in the public archives. Where exactly did you serve? Lucille looked at him for a long moment. The terminal was still. Tension hung like storm clouds. Finally, she spoke, softly, slowly, each word a stone dragged across memory. I wasn't supposed to wear it in public. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her duffel. They told me it'd make me a target. Elias froze. He had heard a lot of things in his career. Declassification horror stories, friendly fire secrets, even Cold War missions that never officially happened. But this felt different. Who told you that? He asked. Lucille looked up just for a moment. And in that split second, something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, not guilt, resentment. She didn't answer. Elias instinctively reached for his phone. Not to record but to call someone. A name flashed in his mind. Colonel Stanley Monroe, head of historical preservation at the Pentagon. If anyone could make sense of this, it was him. But before Elias could dial, something else caught his eye. Tucked just beneath Lucille's duffel strap was a tiny patch, barely visible, stitched in a different fabric, almost unnoticeable, unless you were military. It bore a letter and number code he'd only seen once, inside a restricted annex of the National Archives. And his heart stopped. Because that code wasn't for public service. It was for clandestine communications intelligence during the Vietnam War. A unit erased from official records by executive order. Elias looked up at Lucille, stunned. You weren't just a member of the 302nd, he whispered. You were part of something they buried. Lucille stared at him, her voice barely audible over the hum of the airport. And they're still watching. Elias Granger remained crouched beside Lucille, his body a fortress of calm, though his mind surged with questions. Around them, the airport had grown into a strange theater. Phones raised, travelers whispering, security watching from a distance. But none dared interrupt the gravity between the two. Lucille sat on a molded plastic bench, her duffel at her feet, her hand still resting over the fading insignia that had ignited all of this. Her knuckles were swollen with age, her fingers veined and stiff. Still, her posture held something defiant, unyielding. Elias lowered himself gently beside her, ignoring the creak in his knees. The polished brass of his own uniform gleamed under the terminal lights. Beside Lucille's, it looked almost artificial, too pristine, too untouched. He cleared his throat softly, not to demand, but to invite. You don't owe me a thing, he said, voice hushed. But if you want to tell it, I'm listening. Lucille didn't answer immediately. Her gaze lingered on the check-in monitors overhead, scanning destinations she didn't care about. For a moment it seemed she might stay silent. But then, in a voice cracked with age and history, she began. I was 23, she said. Didn't even tell my mother where I was going. She thought I was taking a job as a clerk in DC. She paused, lips pressing thin. I was stationed in Da Nang. Communications intelligence. Code breakers, listening posts, signal relay. We intercepted enemy comms. Sometimes US chatter too, when it turned dirty. I was recruited because I had a near photographic memory. And because I didn't scare easy. Elias tried not to blink too fast. Black women weren't supposed to be on those missions. Not then. Not in the war theater. Lucille smiled grimly, sensing his thoughts. They didn't put me on record. They said the sight of a Negro woman in uniform behind classified comms could cause security confusion. That was the phrase. Elias exhaled slowly. She continued, her tone even, but hollowed by time. They told me to use an alias. Trained me to blend in. There were 12 of us. Women. 6 white. 4 Asian American. 1 Latina. Just me. Black. They split us up. Never allowed to be photographed together. Never called by our real names outside the bunker. Elias leaned forward, stunned. Lucille's eyes remained far away. My team cracked 2 codes that stopped ambushes, saved hundreds. One of ours intercepted a signal from a US contractor, selling troop positions to the VC. We reported it. Her jaw tensed. Her fingers curled on her lap. Next morning, our backup comms were fried. Someone snuck in and poured acid over the tapes. That night, my barracks caught fire. Elias blinked. What? I jumped from the 2nd floor. Shattered my hip. The fire report said faulty wiring. But my bunkmate? She was suffocated. Pillow to the face. No burns. He stared at her, breath caught between disbelief and outrage. They said it was grief, she murmured. Said I must have imagined things. The investigation was closed in 48 hours. And I was sent back with a dishonorable recommendation for insubordination and psychological instability. Elias's chest tightened. Lucille chuckled, without humor. I got lucky. A colonel with a conscience reversed the discharge. Quietly. No ceremony. No medals. I came home with a limp and a sealed file. And after that, I tried to attend a veterans dinner in Georgia. Wore my uniform. A woman at the door said, "The kitchen staff entrance is in the back." Elias looked away, jaw clenched. Another VFW hall said I needed sponsor verification. When I gave them my serial number, the clerk laughed and said, "Ma'am, that number doesn't exist." He thought I was senile, or lying. Lucille lowered her gaze. I stopped trying. No point showing up where history doesn't want you. A long silence settled between them. Elias finally asked quietly, "Why still wear it?" Lucille exhaled slowly. "Because it's mine. And every thread in it was paid for in fire, in silence, in being erased." She looked down at the uniform on her lap. "It's all I have. No family, no pension, no new one to replace it." VFW said replacement uniforms required documented honorable discharge. Mine's buried in a vault somewhere labeled confidential irregular. Her voice wavered. "Just once. So this one stays with me. Worn or not." Elias stared at her, words failing. The revelation curled like smoke in his chest. A woman who risked everything for her country. Denied. Burned. Forgotten. Called a fraud in public. He glanced at the people around them. Some still watching. Some now ashamed. Others pretending to scroll their phones as if the truth didn't weigh the air around them. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his personal phone, one encrypted and used for high-level military contacts only. He tapped quickly. Lucille looked at him. "What are you doing?" Elias didn't answer right away. The phone rang once, twice. A voice picked up sharp, crisp. "General Granger? This is urgent," he said. Eyes still on Lucille. "I need verification on a personnel file flagged in a declassified Vietnam-era comms unit, possibly under alternate ID. I need it unlocked. I want confirmation on any activity linked to 332nd Auxiliary Code Bravo X-ray." The line crackled. The voice on the other end shifted. More cautious now.
"That's a dormant black file. You sure you want to poke that?"
Elias's voice dropped to a near growl. "She served. She bled. She's sitting here right now being laughed at by children because we buried her name. Silent. We'll get back to you," the voice said. Elias ended the call and turned back to Lucille. "We're not letting this stay in the dark anymore." Lucille smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You might not have a choice," she said. "Not everything buried stays quiet." Just then Elias's phone buzzed again. Not a call, but a message. From a restricted military number. Stop digging. Final warning. He looked up sharply. And Lucille? She didn't even flinch. The moment was barely 2 minutes long. Just enough for the algorithm to grab, analyze and amplify. Shaky hands. Mocking voices. Faded fabric on a black woman's back. The clip captured everything. Lucille struggling to pick up her boarding pass. The influencers cackling about Harriet Tubman in uniform. And the boy behind the camera zooming in on her trembling hands, captioned with 3 laughing emojis, and the words, "She thinks she in a war movie." The video went live on TikTok at 3. By 3:26 it had 7. By 4:12 it had exploded to 1.2 million. The internet thrives on cruelty. Until it doesn't. This time, something shifted. Because just as the video surged with toxic comments, a clip from another passenger emerged. The second video picked up right after the first. Elias Granger standing in uniform, identifying Lucille's unit, and unleashing a quiet storm of reverence. "This woman's not a joke," he had said. "She's military royalty." The 2 videos collided online like tectonic plates. The first, dripping with ignorance. The second, burning with truth. Within hours, social media flipped like a switch. The same audience that mocked Lucille turned on the influencers with the wrath of a nation reintroduced to its sins. By midnight, Respect Lucille was the #1 trending topic on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Clips from news anchors aired side by side. A war hero, mocked at the airport. This is what institutional erasure looks like in real time. A woman who served in silence, now breaking the internet in defiance. Comments flooded in by the hundreds of thousands.
"This hurt my soul. That woman's a damn queen."
Apologized to her, loudly. "I showed this to my grandfather," he cried. But the most powerful reaction came from someone unexpected. Retired 4-star General Stanley Bruton. A man whose resume included 2 war zones, a seat on the Joint Chiefs, and a Medal of Honor, posted a response on LinkedIn. Of all places. He didn't use emojis. He didn't yell. He simply wrote, "She wore that uniform before any of us knew what courage meant. I demand a formal apology be issued. Immediately." Then he added one sentence that shook every military forum online. "She outranks your ignorance." His post was shared across every major platform. CNN picked it up. MSNBC ran a segment titled, "Erased No More." Fox News hesitated, then reluctantly joined in, branding the incident as a learning moment for the youth. By 9:02 p.m., reporters were contacting airport authorities. The TSA quietly confirmed that security footage aligned with Lucille's version of events. They released a carefully worded statement praising her long-standing service and dignity under public pressure. But even more quietly, internal Department of Defense emails began circulating. Someone in communications flagged a problem. Lucille Jackson's name wasn't appearing in any public veteran registries. Not under active, retired, or deceased lists. A deeper search found a redacted service file, but the metadata showed the record had been accessed only once in the last 25 years, by a restricted Pentagon terminal. Whispers spread in Washington. Who is this woman? Back online, her image became a symbol. Artists started digital illustrations of her uniform, cracks and all. One portrait showed her standing tall in front of a burning barracks. The caption, "They tried to burn her. She still stood." Another in stark black and white, labeled, "The uniform they laughed at will outlive them all." Teachers began assigning the video as required civics material. One educator in Chicago wrote, "My 8th graders just watched both clips. Half the class was in tears." One student asked why this isn't in our history books. I didn't have an answer. Meanwhile, the original influencers tried to backpedal. The boy who filmed the video posted a shaky apology. "Didn't know she was like, real military. We were just playing. My bad." The comments roasted him mercilessly. "You filmed an elder in distress for views. You don't get to say my bad. This ain't about real military. It's about basic respect. Delete your account and go touch grass." The girl who laughed the loudest posted a tearful Instagram story. Heavy mascara, shaky voice. "We didn't mean it like that. We just thought it was funny." People weren't buying it. An internet sleuth uncovered that she'd posted a valor check meme 3 months prior mocking an elderly Latino man in uniform outside a Walmart. The pattern was clear. Within 24 hours, their sponsorship deals vanished. Clothing brands quietly removed the tags from their bios. One was dropped from a collaborative podcast. The group's accounts became war zones of public outrage. Meanwhile, Lucille knew none of this. She had returned home, her tiny two-bedroom duplex in a forgotten corner of East Baltimore. Her TV was unplugged, her phone screen cracked, and barely usable. The Wi-Fi router hadn't worked in weeks. She didn't even own a laptop. Instead, she sat in her living room, sipping weak coffee from a chipped mug. Her old uniform hung gently over the back of a chair. She looked at it sometimes, not for vanity, but memory. When a neighbor knocked to say they saw her on the news, she nodded politely, said, "Oh, I doubt that," and closed the door. She had no idea the country was screaming her name. No idea that politicians were tweeting about her. No idea that a high school in Atlanta had just renamed its auditorium the Lucille Jackson Hall of Honor. She just sat there, watching dust float in the sunbeam coming through the blinds, not knowing that people across the nation had started asking, why wasn't she in our textbooks? Who else did we forget? But something was shifting, far from the noise of the internet. In a control room 2 states away, Homeland Security analysts monitored the digital tsunami. Someone flagged a phrase that kept reappearing in anonymous comments. 303-second black echo. Buried alive. It wasn't just a viral moment anymore. It was a classified problem resurfacing. The next morning, before the sun rose over her block, a black SUV with government plates pulled quietly to the curb in front of Lucille's home. 3 men stepped out in silence and knocked. Lucille Jackson didn't answer the door the first time they knocked. She had seen the SUV from her window. Blacked out windows, matte finish, no markings except the whisper of a government-grade antenna curling out the back. The knock that followed was not forceful, not aggressive, but precise, tactful, like the sound of someone who didn't need to knock twice. Lucille's hand hovered above the doorknob. Her heart wasn't racing, not from fear, but from memory. It sounded like 1974 again. The same rhythm, the same tension in the air, like the walls themselves had gone quiet to listen. She opened the door slowly. 3 men stood in tailored black suits, their expressions tight but not hostile. The tallest held out an envelope, white, thick, embossed with the seal of the executive office of the president. "Mrs. Jackson?" he asked, with the practiced diplomacy of someone trained to handle political time bombs. Lucille nodded, her eyes drifting between them. No ID badges, no introductions, just her name in that envelope. "You've been formally invited," the man said, "to speak at the Arlington Memorial Day commemoration." He paused, watching her reaction. By direct request of the president. Lucille didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she took the envelope and closed the door without another word. Inside, the weight of the invitation was immediate. The cardstock had a slight texture, the calligraphy too ornate to be machine-made. Her name had been written by hand. The letter was brief, elegant, official. "In recognition of your enduring courage, patriotism, and unacknowledged service to the nation, the President of the United States respectfully invites you to deliver opening remarks at Arlington National Cemetery on Memorial Day. A car will be arranged. Lodging secured. Security ensured. The country needs to hear your voice." Lucille read it twice. Then she slid it onto her kitchen table beside a stack of unpaid bills and turned on the kettle. The past didn't come back all at once. It didn't scream. It whispered. The last time they sent her to D.C., she was 28. Her hip still healing, her voice still raw from the fire. They had flown her in quietly. No escort, no public briefing. Just a series of backdoor interviews with military analysts who never made eye contact, and a final meeting with 2 men in an unmarked building who told her, in very polite language, that her testimony was non-constructive to national cohesion. They thanked her for her service, and reminded her that her file was classified under federal directive for her own protection. She hadn't been asked to speak then. She'd been asked to disappear, and she had. So when Elias called that afternoon, bubbling with hope, Lucille's tone was ice. "You knew they were going to come," she said. "I hoped they would," Elias admitted. "I made the call, Lucille. I contacted the White House press office after the video hit 4 million. It wasn't just a story, it was a reckoning." Lucille said nothing. "You deserve to speak. Not just for you, for everyone buried in silence." She finally sighed, the breath deep and gravelly. "You think they want me to tell the truth?" she asked. "Or do they want to pin me to a flag, smile for the camera, and sweep it all back under marble and wreaths?" Elias's voice softened. "I think for once the country might be ready to hear you." Lucille chuckled bitterly. The country's always ready to use me, General. That ain't the same. She paused, her tone sharpening. I'll go, she said. But I'm wearing my uniform. Elias hesitated. I'll see if we can. The real one, she interrupted. Stains and all. The one they laughed at in the airport. The one they tried to burn. She didn't wait for a response. That night, Lucille pulled the uniform from its place on the chair and laid it across her bed. The fabric sagged in the middle. Threads unraveled along the hem. The metals had dulled to a tarnished bronze, no longer gleaming like polished honor, but carrying the worn dignity of survival. She ran a damp cloth over it, careful not to scrub too hard, not to erase the past. She smoothed the sleeve where the unit tag rested. 32nd Fighter Group, BX-41. The ghost unit. In the quiet of her bedroom, she whispered to no one in particular. We're not hiding anymore. The next morning, a different SUV arrived. Sleek, polished, with the official seal this time. Lucille stepped outside with her duffel bag, the uniform on her back. Her gait was slow but steady. No cane, no help. Her spine bent, but her head high. The driver, a black woman in her 30s, nodded with quiet reverence. I'll be your escort to DC, ma'am. Lucille nodded back and slid into the back seat. The car pulled from the curb, slowly rolling past familiar sidewalks, the cracked pavement of her block, the boarded-up church, the corner store that still had her picture on the wall from when she once stopped a robbery with just her voice. She didn't look back. The ride was quiet. The windows tinted. Her driver said little. Occasionally, Elias would call in with updates. The press is buzzing. You're going to be front page tomorrow, he said. Lucille remained focused on the horizon. Halfway through the drive, she reached into her bag and pulled out the photo again. The same one she'd shown Elias in the airport. The black and white group shot. 12 people now likely reduced to 1. She traced the face of a woman standing beside her in the photo. Private Ernestine Moss, killed in the barracks fire. Officially listed as accidental suffocation. Lucille knew better. She tucked the photo back in her pocket. As they crossed the state line into Virginia, Lucille glanced into the side mirror. At first it was instinct. Habit from another life. But then her eyes narrowed. Behind them, a black SUV tailed at a consistent distance. Not close enough to appear aggressive. Not far enough to disappear. It wasn't one of theirs. Lucille's fingers tensed around the seatbelt. Can you speed up a little, she asked the driver. The woman checked the rear view and nodded, pressing the gas slightly. Still, the SUV matched them. Turn for turn. Speed for speed. Lucille leaned forward. Pull over at the next rest stop. The driver hesitated. Ma'am, we have a schedule. Lucille's voice hardened. Next. Stop. They exited onto a near-empty rest area, flanked by trees. A single vending machine hummed beside the bathroom facility. As their SUV pulled into a space, the trailing vehicle didn't stop. It glided past slowly. Lucille stared. The plate. D8457. Her chest tightened. That was the same plate from the surveillance vehicle that sat outside her Virginia debrief room in 1976. She'd memorized it after watching it idle for 5 hours without moving once. They had changed the car, not the watchful eyes. Lucille turned to her driver, voice low. Get me to DC now. And tell Elias, they never stopped watching. The guest suite at the Hay Adams Hotel overlooked the White House, its windows framed by silk curtains and the quiet hum of history. But for Lucille Jackson, it may as well have been a holding cell. The grandeur of the room, crystal lamps, antique writing desk, a bowl of fruit too perfect to be real, felt sterile, artificial, like a curated exhibit designed to distract from what it was really built for, containment. She sat on the edge of the bed, her uniform laid out beside her. Staring at it, she ran her hand across the sleeve, gently pressing the frayed stitching over the insignia that had stirred a nation. It was a night before Arlington, a night before she was to speak on national television, before dignitaries, politicians, generals, and a country just beginning to remember her name. And that's when she saw it. An envelope, slipped under her door. No knock, no sound, just shadow and silence. She stood cautiously, knees stiff from the long ride, and bent to retrieve it. The envelope was unmarked. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typed. No greeting. No signature. Be careful what you say tomorrow. You've lasted this long. Don't waste it. Lucille read it twice. then folded it slowly and set it on the nightstand, not beside her speech notes, but on top of them. She didn't flinch, but her eyes hardened. By morning, Elias Granger was already waiting in the lobby, pacing near the concierge desk, phone in hand, dress uniform pressed to perfection. He looked like a man prepared for war, not the military kind, but the one fought in hallways, headlines and hidden hands. The moment he saw Lucille exit the elevator, he straightened. "You slept?" he asked, like a soldier surrounded by landmines. She replied. He offered a smile, but it didn't last. "There's something you need to know," he said, voice lowered. "A colleague at the Pentagon, retired, but still wired into internal chatter, sent me a red flag. Apparently, 2 retired generals from the Vietnam era filed formal concerns about your upcoming speech." Lucille raised an eyebrow. "Concerns? They're not calling you a liar outright," Elias explained, "but they're urging narrative alignment for national unity. In short, they want your speech scrubbed before it touches a podium." Lucille didn't blink. "Let me guess. They're not here to hear it themselves?" "No. But they've sent someone who is." As if on cue, the elevator dinged again. A woman in her mid-40s stepped out. Tall, sharp suit, the kind of heels that never scuffed. She walked toward them with the confidence of someone used to controlling the room. "Mrs. Jackson," she greeted with a professional smile. "I'm Samantha Dorr, from the Department of Defense Communications Office. I've been assigned to assist with your remarks, purely support of course." Lucille stared at her. "Support like you gave us in '68, or more like the kind we got in '73 when they called us ghosts?" Samantha's smile faltered slightly but held. "We just want to ensure that your legacy is preserved with honor." Lucille stepped closer. "My legacy doesn't need preserving," she said softly. "It needs uncovering." Samantha nodded tightly. "Of course, but we encourage a tone that inspires, not one that reopens old wounds. The audience includes foreign dignitaries, school children." Lucille cut her off. "I'm not here to soothe the room. I'm here to wake it." There was a long pause. Elias crossed his arms. Samantha finally nodded. "Very well. We'll provide a teleprompter, but you're free to adjust." She walked away, heels clicking like punctuation marks. Lucille turned to Elias. "She's not here to help," she said. "She's here to watch," he agreed. Later that afternoon, as the rehearsal tents were being erected at Arlington, a man approached Lucille near the reflecting pool, tall, white-haired, wearing a faded service jacket with an old insignia mostly worn away. He looked at her as if confirming something unspoken. "You don't remember me," he said, "but I remember you, 1969. Da Nang. You intercepted a code that got my team out of an ambush. I was a second lieutenant back then." Lucille squinted slightly, recognition stirring faintly behind her eyes. "Colonel Robert Tellman," he said, extending a hand, "retired. And off the record." Lucille shook it, cautiously. "I heard what they're doing," he said, "trying to clean up history before it ever hits a microphone. That's not justice. That's theater." He reached into his coat and pulled out a manila folder, thick and aged, stamped with the faded red of confidential. "I've had this for years," he continued. "Didn't know what to do with it. It's not mine to tell, but it is yours to reveal." Lucille took the file, eyes narrowing. "What's in it?" she asked. "Proof. Pages from classified personnel reports. Redacted entries. Missions you led. Sabotage incidents they buried. And a list." Lucille's grip tightened. "What kind of list?" "People the military flagged for surveillance after service. Those labeled suppressed personnel. You were number 6. Lucille stood still, the weight of the folder heavier than her uniform. Her voice cracked just slightly. "Why me?" Tellman looked away for a second. "Because you were never supposed to exist, Lucille. A black woman with clearance higher than her male counterparts. It rattled them. The moment you reported racial targeting inside your unit, you were marked. Not discharged, not erased, suppressed." Lucille looked down at the file. "This changes everything," she murmured. "No," Tellman said gently. "This proves everything." That night she returned to her hotel, locking the door behind her. The folder sat on the desk under the lamp, its edges fraying like old wounds. She opened it. There were photographs, grainy black and white images of her younger self in full gear, headset on, inside a jungle communications outpost. Her signature on mission logs, notes with her real name scribbled beside code names, but the last page was what stopped her breath. A typed list, dated July Top of the page, personnel for quiet monitoring. Category disruptive narrative risks. 6 names. 5 crossed out in red.
The 6th?
Jackson, Ellen. Status. Contained. Surveillance ongoing. Lucille stared at it, her throat dry. It wasn't just memory now. It was proof. She wasn't paranoid. She was documented. Her hotel phone rang. Not her cell. The landline. She stared at it. It rang again, and again. She picked it up. A voice raspy old whispered one line before disconnecting. Don't speak at Arlington. We remember what you tried before. The air above Arlington National Cemetery was still too still, as if even the wind had been instructed to stand at attention. The white marble graves stretched like frozen waves across the hill, quiet witnesses to the nation's grief and glory. Rows of folding chairs had been arranged for dignitaries and press, while behind them, a swelling sea of civilians stood in hushed anticipation. Lucille Jackson approached the podium, her steps steady but deliberate. Her original uniform clung to her frame like a second skin, threadbare but dignified. The fabric bore the wrinkles of time, the faded stains of duty, and the tremors of a life never fully honored. It wasn't new, it wasn't polished, but it was real. Camera shutters clicked softly as she moved, the broadcast capturing every second, beamed live across cable networks, live streamed across social media, played on high school smartboards and barroom TVs alike. Behind her, the tomb of the unknown stood silent, flanked by the changing of the guard, a tradition of precision and reverence. But today, every head turned to Lucille. No one interrupted. Not yet. She gripped the sides of the podium, fingers visibly shaking, not from nerves but from weight. Not the weight of the microphone, but of the moment. She leaned into it and began. My name, she said, voice cracking faintly through the speakers, is Lucille M. Jackson. Former communications officer. Former signal analyst. Former ghost. A pause. The crowd held its breath. I served in Vietnam as part of an auxiliary unit operating under the 302nd Fighter Group. Yes, the Tuskegee lineage. My file doesn't appear in military databases. My medals aren't displayed in glass cases. But I was there. Her eyes scanned the crowd. You can Google it now. You've seen the video. You've seen the uniform. But what you haven't seen is the fire. The barracks fire they never investigated. The comrades whose deaths were called accidents. The missions we succeeded in, before they erased our names. A ripple passed through the crowd. After my unit intercepted transmissions of internal sabotage, I filed a report, not against the enemy, but against my own. Men with higher ranks, lighter skin, fewer qualifications, but infinite power. Lucille's voice steadied, hardened. Within 48 hours, our records were sealed. We were scattered across the country. I was told to be silent, that my uniform, my clearance, my truth, were all dangerous. In the audience, a woman in uniform lowered her sunglasses to hide the tears. An older black man gripped his grandson's hand tighter. Lucille took a breath. I stand here today, not because justice was done, but because a teenager filmed me being humiliated in an airport, and it went viral. There was a pause. Laughter wasn't dared, but the bitter irony landed. She continued, her voice more controlled now. I wore this uniform when I was 23. I wore it when I buried a sister in arms, whose name you'll never know. I wore it when the VA turned me away. I wore it when a VFW hall called me a fraud, and I wear it today, on this sacred ground, because I earned it. There was movement in the back, several attendees slowly rising to their feet, a quiet growing wave of respect. Lucille's tone grew more intimate. There are others like me, others who never got this microphone, whose families never got folded flags, who died with secrets in their mouths and service in their veins. She reached into her duffel, pulled out a single worn folder. This, she said, holding it up, is a file marked suppressed personnel. It contains names, my name, and others. It's real. It's been hidden for decades. And I dare this government, on this day, on this land, to explain why. The tension fractured. Gasps filled the silence. Several in the audience, including a retired general, shifted in their seats, faces suddenly pale. Lucille steadied her voice once more. I am not here to disrupt Memorial Day. I'm here to complete it, to remind you that memory without truth is just tradition. She looked at the press row, dead into the camera. To the children watching in classrooms, the cadets in training, the little black girls told they're too loud, too soft, Too proud. This uniform is yours too. And don't let anyone tell you it belongs to someone else. More people rose. Not everyone. Some still squirmed. But the tide was turning. And then she ended. Not with a shout, but with a line sharpened by decades of silence. You buried me in silence. Her voice softened, but grew stronger with every syllable. But I wore the uniform louder than any of you. In the front row, a woman in civilian clothes reached into her coat, pulled out a military ID, and dropped it in her lap, stunned. Her name was on Lucille's list. She wasn't the only one still alive. The applause at Arlington had barely faded when the knives came out. Before Lucille Jackson had even returned to her hotel suite, cable news had already begun its dissection, not of her message, not of the contents of her speech, but of her credibility. By midnight, the celebration had morphed into interrogation. Fox Nation ran a headline, "Truth or Tarnish? The Curious Case of Lucille Jackson's War Story." A panel of polished hosts sat around a glossy desk, eyebrows raised, smiles too tight. One of them laughed. "I'm sorry, but does anyone else find it odd that no one heard of this woman until a TikTok video? Sounds like stolen valor went viral." Another chimed in, "Exactly. No service record in the VA. No honorable discharge certificate. I mean, come on. Those medals looked like they came off eBay." Within hours, the echo chambers on YouTube, Twitter, and political podcasts lit up with venom. Is she even who she says she is? The phrase became a digital chant, repeated and weaponized across platforms. Clips of her speech were remixed into parody videos. One right-wing influencer, clad in a knockoff uniform from a Halloween store, mocked her line word for word. "You buried me in silence, but I wore the uniform louder than any of you." He mimicked in a falsetto tone before bursting into laughter. The video racked up over 3 million views in 12 hours. Another streamer displayed her photo on screen and scoffed, "That ain't a war hero. That's a history-themed grifter. Probably never left Baltimore." But the most chilling backlash didn't come from content creators or paid pundits. It came from within. Former military officials began releasing quiet statements, each more carefully worded than the last. Retired General Clay Dorr, father of Samantha Dorr, the PR officer who had guided Lucille's speech, spoke on a conservative radio show. His voice carried the calm authority of someone used to bending narratives. "I've reviewed what's available," he said. "And with all due respect, I never saw or heard of a Lucille Jackson in any comms intelligence capacity. Not under the 332nd. Not under any black op directives." He paused. And frankly, if someone had tried to accuse our own ranks of sabotage back then, they'd have been removed for psychiatric evaluation. Not silenced. Protected from themselves. The host nodded solemnly, feeding the narrative. "So this sounds more like revisionist theater than real military history." "Precisely," Dorr replied. "A tragic distortion." That single interview triggered a wave of doubt. Hashtags like Traig stolen speech and valor, or victim began trending. Lucille's inbox, though she rarely checked it, flooded with threats, questions, and passive-aggressive offers to help her set the record straight. Meanwhile, Elias Granger sat in his temporary office in D.C., eyes bloodshot, phone ringing endlessly. "She's being smeared," he said into the receiver, voice taut with fury, "by people who knew she existed and erased her anyway." On the other end of the line, his Pentagon contact whispered back, "We're seeing movement. Old doors are opening." The speech forced some hands. Elias paused. "How old?" "9." The call ended. That afternoon, he received a confidential message from a retired archivist who had once worked in the sub-basement of the National Archives, the vault that stored special files, the ones most historians never even knew existed. The message was simple. "I found something. A cassette. Label says LJ41. Da Nang. Unauthorized Intel Com. 1973. It's yours if you want it, but you didn't get it from me." Within hours, Elias was sitting alone in his rented car, parked in a forgotten garage 2 blocks from the Capitol, holding a cassette tape inside a sealed evidence bag. He stared at the label. LJ4. Lucille Jackson. Unit BX40.
No doubt.
He drove straight to her hotel. Inside, Lucille was seated in her chair near the window, watching the news with the volume off. The images were loud enough, her face on every screen, headlines flashing like warning lights. "The hidden veteran, hero or hoax? Silence speaks." But should we believe it? She didn't move when Elias entered. "Let me guess," she said. They're saying I forged my memories now? He gently placed the cassette on the table. No. They're about to hear your voice from Lucille looked down at the bag, her eyes narrowing. Her hand hovered over it, hesitant. What is this? She asked, her voice quieter now.
It's a transmission you made.
A field recording from your bunker, in Da Nang. You reported sabotage, despite direct orders not to transmit that intel. Lucille's face paled slightly. She hadn't heard that voice in 5 decades. Hadn't expected to. You got this from someone who shouldn't have had it, she whispered. Elias nodded. And I'm going to leak it to someone who shouldn't be able to play it on national TV. She laughed bitterly, the sound short and dry. You think proof will shut them up? They don't care about truth. They care about control. He sat beside her.
Maybe.
But the truth has teeth now, Lucille. And it's biting back. Lucille stared at the cassette for a long moment. Then she reached for it slowly, reverently, and held it in her hands like a fragile relic. Her fingers trembled. She didn't cry. She just breathed. Because even after all these years, the voice on that tape would tell the world what she'd carried in silence. As Elias reached for his phone to coordinate the leak, a message flashed across the screen from an unknown number. If you play that tape, you'll end up on a list too. The corridors of the Rayburn House office building, usually filled with bureaucratic shuffle and whispered ambition, had never felt so tense. The marble floors echoed louder. The flags hung stiffer. The security detail was heavier. Something rare was happening, and everyone knew it. A congressional subcommittee had convened an emergency hearing under the title, Institutional Erasure, the Forgotten Records of Minority Service Members. It was on paper a historical inquiry, but in practice it was a reckoning. At the center of it all, Lucille M. Jackson. She arrived flanked by a 12-person military honor guard, uniformed men and women from every branch, diverse in background, unified in posture. Their presence wasn't merely ceremonial. It was symbolic, a silent declaration that Lucille wasn't walking into this alone. Elias Granger, now in full dress blues, walked at her side. As they entered the hearing room, a surge of flashbulbs lit the air. The crowd inside was packed beyond capacity. Reporters, historians, veterans, and young activists who had grown up never hearing her name, until a TikTok clip shattered the silence. Lucille wore the same uniform she had worn at Arlington. No upgrades, no replacements. The stains were still visible, and today, for the first time in 5 decades, she wore every single medal she had earned, some finally retrieved from old archives after a rapid Pentagon review triggered by the viral tape. The hearing was chaired by Senator Ramona Elliott, a moderate who had made racial equity her latest talking point. But Lucille wasn't there for anyone's agenda. She took her seat, adjusted the microphone, and waited. Senator Elliott began politely. Ms. Jackson, we appreciate your courage in coming forward. We understand this is not easy. Lucille gave a quiet nod. It's not supposed to be. The first questions were respectful, measured. A few asked about the timeline of her service, her last known station, the fire, the loss of her unit, but it didn't stay polite for long. Senator Curtis Malden, a defense hawk from Texas with a history of minimizing institutional racism, leaned forward, fingers steepled. Ms. Jackson, you're asking the American people to believe that a high-clearance black female communications officer was embedded in a classified unit and then systematically erased, and that no one knew. Lucille met his stare calmly. I'm not asking. I'm showing.
Where's the official record?
Malden pressed. Why weren't you debriefed with other Vietnam veterans? Why did your name not appear in any citations or military reports until last month? Elias leaned forward then, pulling a thick document from a leather folder. With permission, he said, addressing the chair. Senator Elliott nodded. Elias began to read. Operational Directive 4B-72, dated April 18, 1973. Subject, Signal Intelligence Rotation. Southeast Asia Theater. Officer Designation, L.M. Jackson. Clearance Level Black Echo 7, authorized under the command of General Morris Langley. He passed copies to the committee. Every page bore a red declassification stamp dated just 5 days earlier. These orders, Elias continued, were discovered inside a non-digitized vault, marked Legacy Cold Files pending destruction. They were never entered into the central database, because they weren't supposed to be. The room stirred. Senator Malden scoffed. A classified file discovered conveniently after a viral video? I'm not saying it's staged, but you don't have to say it. Lucille interrupted. You're implying it. And you've been implying that my service doesn't count unless it's easy to find. But that's the point, Senator. It was never supposed to be easy to find. Gasps moved through the room. Lucille leaned in slightly, her voice sharpened by age but never more clear. I intercepted U.S. contractors selling troop locations to the enemy. I uncovered sabotage. I blew a whistle that no one wanted heard. And when I didn't die in the fire meant for me, I was buried in paper. Elias slid another paper across the table. Attached is an internal memo signed by General Langley himself, he said. It outlines the removal of whistleblowers from official records in the interest of unit cohesion. Lucille's name is circled in red. The mood shifted palpably. Journalists whispered furiously into their recorders. Members of the gallery sat straighter. Even Senator Elliott's expression turned grim. Senator Malden looked down, momentarily quiet. A few rows back, a Marine veteran stood silently, hand over heart. Public opinion, which had begun its swing during Lucille's Arlington speech, now surged fully in her favor. The leaked cassette, already authenticated by forensic audio experts, had gone viral once again, this time under the tag Done Voices Unburied. Lucille's voice from 1973 was now being studied in classrooms and quoted in documentaries still being cut. She had become the voice of an era, erased, a figure both mourned and celebrated, living evidence that not all wounds leave visible scars. By the end of the hearing, the committee voted unanimously to open a formal investigation into Cold War-era suppression of service members of color. Lucille's case was declared the catalyst for what would now be known as the Justice Review of Forgotten Veterans. And just when she thought the day had exhausted every possible shock, a clerk approached her with a note. Lucille unfolded it slowly. 3 lines. Handwritten. You remember me. You knew my rank. You reported me. I didn't burn back then. But I'm still waiting to speak. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Minjae Holmes. Major Holmes. Her former commanding officer. The man who dismissed her sabotage warning as emotional instability. The man whose shadow lingered long after Vietnam. Lucille stared at the note. A second line was scrawled beneath the signature. Meet me, alone, before the next hearing. You buried me in silence. Her voice softened, but grew stronger with every syllable. But I wore the uniform louder than any of you. In the front row, a woman in civilian clothes reached into her coat, pulled out a military ID, and dropped it in her lap, stunned. Her name was on Lucille's list. You buried me in silence. Her voice softened, but grew stronger with every syllable. But I wore the uniform louder than any of you. In the front row, a woman in civilian clothes reached into her coat, pulled out a military ID, and dropped it in her lap, stunned. Her name was on Lucille's list. The address was handwritten, folded neatly into the note Lucille received in the hearing room. No return number, no encryption, just a place St. Margaret's Veterans Hospice, room, a side wing of a VA hospital in Northern Virginia. It was the kind of place where names slowly faded off the rosters, and nurses spoke with soft voices to men who'd once barked commands over radios in war zones. Lucille hadn't planned to go. Not immediately. But something in the handwriting kept pulling her back. It was jagged, uncertain, as if written by a hand used to giving orders, not asking for mercy. She arrived just before dusk, wearing her uniform once again, not for him, for herself, for every day she had worn it before being told she didn't deserve to. The air in room 416 was thick with disinfectant and death. Faint beeping from monitors, a small oxygen tank humming beside the bed, curtains pulled halfway. The only light came from a shaded lamp near a metal-framed bed, where a man lay propped on pillows, thinner than she remembered. His skin yellowed from sickness. Major Douglas Sharp. She knew that jawline, knew the sharp angles of his face, the piercing, judgmental eyes now dulled by time and morphine. He saw her before she spoke. He smiled faintly. Not warm, resigned. You came, he rasped. Lucille didn't smile. She didn't sit. She stood at the foot of his bed like a tombstone. You wanted a meeting, she said. You got it. Sharp coughed into a handkerchief, blood-stained at the corners. He gestured toward the chair beside him. Please, he said, voice gravel. I don't have long. Lucille moved slowly, deliberately, and sat. The chair creaked under her, the silence louder than his breathing. You remember me, he asked. She didn't blink. Every day. He chuckled weakly, then coughed again, face contorting in pain. I figured, he said. You always had a good memory. That's what made you dangerous. Lucille tilted her head. Dangerous? Sharp turned toward the ceiling. You were smart. Smarter than the officers. Than me. You decoded things we didn't understand. You read threats before they happened. But it wasn't just that. He paused. You were a black woman. And you were good. Lucille said nothing. She let the truth hang. Sharp's hands fidgeted with the blanket. We'd never seen anything like you. Command wasn't ready for it. We couldn't control it. And I panicked. His eyes welled. Not from guilt. From fear. I wrote the recommendation to move your barracks closer to the fuel tank. I ordered the patrol route to skip your post. I sent the comm relay technician who doctored your outbound reports. When the fire started, I told them not to investigate. Lucille stared at him, motionless. I tried, he said, choking. I tried to get you killed. There it was. The words she always knew but had never heard aloud. Sharp wept. Not the ugly cry of shame, but the quieter one of collapse. A man unraveling in the final hours of a life he'd spent building walls of rationalization. I told myself I was protecting order, he whispered, that the military needed hierarchy, tradition, that exposing sabotage would break it all apart. Lucille leaned forward slightly.
No.
She said, you told yourself that a black woman with power was more dangerous than corruption itself. He nodded through tears. And now I'm dying, and I hear your name on the news. I see people calling you a hero, and I know I did everything I could to erase you. Lucille stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't touch him. Her anger was a presence in the room, calm and unyielding. I outlived your hate, she said, and I carried the silence you put on me longer than you've carried your guilt. Sharp covered his face with trembling hands. You don't have to forgive me, he mumbled. I just couldn't die without saying it. Lucille looked around the room, sterile, windowless, lonely. No medals hung on his wall. No visitors, just the weight of a dying man's truth. You said it, she replied. Now sit with it. She reached into her bag and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper, the copy of her Arlington speech. Without a word, she placed it on his bedside table. This is what I said with the voice you tried to silence. Sharp reached for it, his hand shaking uncontrollably. Lucille turned to leave, pausing at the door. You were right about one thing, she said, without turning. I was dangerous, but not to the military, to the lie you tried to protect. And then she walked out, the sound of her boots soft but final. Behind her, Major Douglas Sharp wept uncontrollably, his body shaking, the beeping of his monitor quickening. A nurse peeked in, startled by the noise. But Lucille didn't look back. She stepped into the hallway, the air suddenly colder. Elias was waiting near the elevator, arms crossed. You went through with it? He asked. She nodded. I gave him the truth, she said. He can take it with him, or choke on it. Elias didn't reply. He didn't have to, because in that moment, they both understood what it meant to outlive, not just oppression, but the people who built it. As they reached the elevator, a young nurse rushed down the hall, calling after them. Mrs. Jackson? There's something he left for you, in a lockbox. He said to give it to you if you ever showed up. Lucille turned, brow furrowed. What is it? She asked. The nurse handed over a small battered metal box, dusty, dented, and sealed with military tape. Lucille opened it. Inside were pages, handwritten logs, coded transmissions, and one photograph, a group of her original unit, including one face she thought had died in the barracks fire, alive, and looking directly at the camera. The wheels of the plane screeched gently against the tarmac as it touched down at Baltimore Washington International. The sun was still rising, casting a warm, amber glow over the runway. Inside the terminal, the early morning crowd buzzed with the usual shuffle of weary travelers, last-minute gate changes, and half-sipped coffee. But this morning, Gate C-14 was different. A line of uniformed soldiers, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, even Coast Guard, stood shoulder to shoulder, dress blues sharp, white gloves crisp. Their faces were solemn, proud, and reverent. In the center of the formation stood a flag bearer holding the stars and stripes high, unmoving. Passengers nearby hushed instinctively, drawn by the stillness that hovered like mist. From the jet bridge, Lucille Jackson emerged, carrying her worn duffel bag and wearing her same threadbare uniform, the very one the world had once laughed at. This time, no one was laughing. The honor guard snapped to salute in perfect unison. The gesture hit Lucille harder than any insult ever had. For a moment, she just stood there, Not frozen, but overwhelmed. The sound of boots clicking. The sight of eyes watching her not with scrutiny but with overdue recognition. It felt almost unreal. A child in a blue hoodie broke the silence. "Look, Mommy. It's the lady from school. The one who helped save the pilots." Lucille looked down, surprised. The boy grinned wide, clutching a hand-drawn picture of her in uniform, red crayon medals across her chest. His teacher had shown the class a new mini-documentary about America's forgotten hero. Within minutes, more children surrounded her, asking questions, asking for selfies, holding out notebooks and caps, and postcards for her to sign. Their parents stepped back respectfully, letting the kids lead.
Then came the veterans.
A man with a prosthetic leg and a Navy tattoo hugged her without asking permission. A Vietnam vet, white, wrinkled, with trembling hands, stood before her with tears in his eyes, and said, "They never let me talk about the black units. I'm sorry it took the internet to find you." Another woman, former Air Force, gently placed a small pin in Lucille's hand. "It's not much," she whispered. "But it's from my father. He flew with the 99th. He said they had angels on the radio. I think he meant you." Lucille didn't cry, but something inside her long locked away, finally exhaled. She made her way slowly through the crowd, a path opening before her like a tide of reverence. The same terminal where she was once filmed being mocked, now rang with applause that rose and swelled like a wave cresting in slow motion. There were no TikTok stunts this time. No laughing. No looking away. Just rows of people, some in uniform, others in t-shirts and sandals, standing to honor the woman who had once been erased. The airport's PA system chimed, and a voice clear and strong echoed. "Attention passengers, please join us in recognizing the honorable service of Lucille M. Jackson, veteran patriot and national truth-bearer. Welcome home." Somewhere between Gate 12 and baggage claim, a teacher waiting to board a flight asked for a photo. She explained how her 8th graders had created a full civics unit titled "Silence Isn't Neutral." Lucille's name was now in the textbooks. Digital copies updated after her speech at Arlington went viral. The Department of Education had greenlit a new curriculum on suppressed service, to be piloted in 27 states. Her face etched in resilience now hung beside Harriet Tubman and Rosa Parks on classroom posters. A group of middle school girls in oversized hoodies chanted, "Lucille, Lucille," as she walked by. Lucille didn't wave. She didn't raise her hand. She just nodded once to each group that stood, her silence now louder than any speech. Elias met her just outside the terminal doors, shielding his eyes from the rising sun. "You've rewritten history," he said, smiling. "No," Lucille replied. "I just filled in the blanks they left." They walked together toward the black SUV that had become oddly familiar. A gentle irony that the very kind of vehicle once used to monitor her was now her escort. Before she could climb in, a soft voice called out behind her. "Excuse me." Lucille turned. A young man stood there awkwardly, shoulders hunched, hands stuffed in the pockets of his bomber jacket. He wore a ball cap low over his eyes, and carried none of the ease he had flaunted in the viral video from weeks ago. Lucille recognized him instantly. The ringleader from Terminal C, the one who had zoomed in on her hands. He stepped forward, slowly, every movement unsure. His phone was nowhere in sight. I don't want to take up much of your time," he began, his voice cracking. I needed to say something in person, not in a comment, not in a stitch." Lucille tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I didn't know who you were," he said. "But that doesn't matter. I shouldn't have laughed. I shouldn't have filmed. You didn't deserve that." Silent. He pulled out something from his pocket. A folded letter. "I wrote this, just in case I froze." He held it out, trembling. Lucille took it. She didn't read it right then. She looked at him. Really looked. He was young. Maybe 20. A boy pretending to be a man on the internet. And now, here he was, stripped of audience and arrogance. Lucille tucked the letter into her jacket. "You got a lot of learning ahead of you," she said softly. "Don't stop." He nodded, too ashamed to meet her eyes. "I'm sorry." Lucille stepped closer, just enough that her voice dropped low. "Next time, don't wait for a crowd to do the right thing." He nodded again, and then she turned back to Elias, stepped into the SUV, and closed the door. As the vehicle pulled away, Lucille unfolded the boy's letter and gasped quietly. Tucked inside was a photo. It was a screenshot of her original service photo. And behind her, barely visible, was another woman in uniform. Lucille froze. It was Ernestine Moss. The woman believed to have died in the barracks fire alive. And in uniform. Date stamp. You buried me in silence. Her voice softened, but grew stronger with every syllable. But I wore the uniform louder than any of you. In the front row, a woman in civilian clothes reached into her coat, pulled out a military ID, and dropped it in her lap, stunned. Her name was on Lucille's list. The auditorium was packed, more so than it had been for any event in the city's recent memory. The stage at the Baltimore Civic Hall, usually reserved for concerts and city council briefings, now held a row of chairs draped in black velvet. A small podium stood at the center, flanked by two massive American flags and a screen playing silent clips from Lucille Jackson's life, her speech at Arlington, footage from her hearing, archival images from Da Nang. In the front row sat teachers, local officials, and veterans, their rows interspersed with students who had once only known war through textbooks and hashtags. But today was different. Today was personal. The event was billed as Baltimore remembers the legacy of Lucille M. Jackson, a citywide acknowledgement of Lucille's full rehabilitation into history, and a symbolic ceremony to present her with the newly minted Freedom Shield Award for historic service. But for Lucille, it wasn't the plaque that mattered. It was what was about to happen next. She stood beside the podium, wearing her uniform one more time, a soft cardigan over her shoulders. Her speech had already ended. She had thanked the city, the students, the historians, the retired archivist, who risked their job to pull her file from the vault. But now the room buzzed with a low murmur, as someone else took the stage. Lucille watched him approach with measured calm. Tyrese, the same boy who had knelt in the airport terminal weeks ago, not out of reverence then, but mockery. He had been the one to record her struggle, the one to zoom in on her trembling hands, the one whose laughter had echoed across social media. Now he stood trembling for a very different reason. Tyrese was only 19, thin, with nervous energy beneath his oversized hoodie, hands clenched in his pockets. But his face had changed since that day. There were no camera-ready smiles, no cocky posture. The crowd murmured, some recognizing him instantly. He stepped to the podium, then paused, looked at Lucille, then dropped to one knee. Gasps rippled through the room. Cameras flashed. Lucille didn't move. She waited. Tyrese's voice, when it came, was quiet, untrained, but full. I ain't got no speech, he said. Didn't write nothing down. Just, I need to say something real. He looked up at the crowd, then directly at Lucille. I didn't know who you were. But that don't matter. I saw an old woman in a uniform, and I laughed, because I thought views were more important than respect. I thought followers meant I was worth something. He paused. But that laugh, it cost me something. Because when I saw your name on that hearing, when I heard what you survived, what they did to you, I felt sick. He looked down at his hands. My grandfather served in Iraq, died in Mosul, never made it back, and for years I hated the military for taking him. But I never asked who came before him, who made it possible for him to serve. He choked on the words. Swallowed hard. I disrespected someone who paved the way for my own blood. Lucille's face remained unreadable, but her eyes watched him closely. Tyrese continued, voice cracking. I saw the picture, the one with you and that other woman in the background. The one you thought died in that fire. Ernestine, right? A hush dropped over the room. She looked like my great-aunt, my grandma's cousin. When I showed her the photo, she broke down, said her name used to be Erna Moss before she went missing. No one ever told the family what happened, just said she disappeared overseas. Lucille's knees nearly buckled, but she gripped the podium, steadying herself. Tyrese looked at her, his voice low now. Honest. You didn't just lose your name. My family lost a whole history. We thought she vanished, but she didn't. She was erased, same way they tried to erase you. He pulled something from his hoodie, a simple envelope. Inside, a photo, the same one from the metal lockbox, but clearer, printed, dated, and signed on the back. E.M., 1975, Italy. Lucille took it in trembling hands. Her breath caught. It was real. Tyrese stood up from his kneeling position, then faced her fully. I'm sorry, he said, but I know that's not enough. Lucille nodded slowly. Her voice was soft but strong. No, it's not. The room froze. But apology is the start of remembering. What comes next? That's what matters. She reached into her uniform pocket, pulled out the original unit patch, worn faded, threads barely holding. The same patch that had made people laugh once. Now it glinted faintly under the stage lights. She held it out to Tyrese. He hesitated. Lucille looked him in the eyes. Make this mean something again. Tyrese took it with reverence, both hands cupped. He clutched it like an oath. Lucille turned back to the microphone. This boy laughed at me once. And now he carries a piece of my history. Let that be the lesson. Not that he mocked, but that he learned, and that the next generation refuses to forget. The crowd stood, first in quiet awe, then in a rising wave of applause that filled the hall with thunderous grace. But behind the cheers, Lucille's thoughts spun. Her hands clutched the photograph tighter. Ernestine was alive, or had been. And that signature, it wasn't just a message. It was a trail. As Lucille stepped off the stage, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. You're getting close, but not everyone wants Ernestine found. The gates of Fort Whitmore had long rusted into a kind of ceremonial dignity. Once a bustling military intelligence base tucked in the Virginia pines, it had been decommissioned 2 decades earlier and turned into a memorial site and archive facility, a museum of quiet regrets and slow reconciliation. The sign out front still bore its original emblem, faded but visible, an eagle mid-flight, talons open, wings scarred. Lucille Jackson hadn't been back since night. As the SUV pulled past the checkpoint, she could almost hear the static hum of radios, the bark of marching drills, the coded click-click of old Morse machines that once vibrated beneath the floors. But those sounds had long vanished, replaced by curated exhibits and dusty air-conditioned silence. Elias Granger stepped out first, eyes scanning the property like it still held ghosts. Didn't think this place would be so untouched, he muttered. Lucille climbed out slower, her movements deliberate. Untouched, she said, means uninvestigated. Tyrese, still adjusting to the surrealness of being in the presence of history and being part of it, followed behind them, a notepad in his jacket and Lucille's old unit patch sewn into the breast of his hoodie. He had become her shadow, her witness, and perhaps most importantly, her proof that the future was listening. The museum curator, a balding man named Rowan, with eyes too kind for federal clearance, greeted them at the door. You're Lucille Jackson, he said quietly, like saying it too loud would wake the foundation. I am, she replied, and I'm here for what you don't have on display. Rowan led them past the main exhibits. Plaques about Cold War surveillance, interactive maps of communications hubs, and a wall of uniform mannequins that didn't feature a single black woman. Behind a set of steel double doors was the archive vault, climate-controlled and sealed tight. They passed through layers of security Lucille never had when she was active. Irony clanged like brass. This is where the undeclared files ended up, Rowan said. Boxes mislabeled, reports without clearance codes, units that didn't exist until they did. The room smelled of old paper and chilled preservation. Shelves lined the space like silent witnesses. Elias, already scanning labels, stopped when he found a small cluster of boxes, stamped B. Lucille stepped forward. I'm finishing what we started, she said, mostly to herself. They spent hours combing through the documents. Tyrese read aloud, coded entries, cross-referencing dates. Elias found encrypted memos with partial references to units that had no command structure listed. Phantoms of operational necessity. One by one, the names appeared. Black, brown, female, hidden. Whispers in documents that hinted at communications sabotage, internal threats, suppressed evaluations. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was a quiet policy, a sanctioned forgetting. We weren't casualties of war, Lucille murmured. We were casualties of hierarchy. Tyrese looked up, brow furrowed. So many names. Elias nodded. They were never supposed to be seen again. It was Tyrese who found the proposal first. A blueprint buried in the back of a personnel folder marked Deny Redact. A sketched concept labeled Memorial of the Silenced DC Installation Proposal, 1977. Lucille stared at it, heart slowing. I remember this, she said. Ernestine and I, we talked about building something after the war. A wall not for the fallen, but the forgotten. Elias stepped closer. Why was it withdrawn? Lucille looked at the small red stamp in the corner, not consistent with morale preservation. She exhaled deeply. The weight of it landing. That's what they called it. Morale preservation. The polite name for hiding shame. The three of them stood in silence for a moment. Then Elias said, let's bring it back. 2 weeks later, Beneath an open sky on the western lawn of the base, a small crowd gathered. There was no stage, no podium, just a smooth patch of earth, and a flat rectangular stone, carved with one inscription: the Memorial of the Silenced, in honor of those who served and were never seen. Lucille stood before the stone, hand resting on its edge. The names would be added later. There were too many to rush. But this stone, this first piece, was the foundation. She spoke softly, without a microphone. Most walls hold back truth. This one will speak it. Therese stood beside her, recording, streaming live to thousands. Elias stood to her left, in uniform, unreadable but present. Behind them, families, many who had only recently discovered their mothers, sisters, aunts, had ever worn a uniform, stood in rows of silence, some holding old photos, some holding back tears. Lucille reached into her coat and pulled out a folder she had retrieved just days earlier. "I found a name today," she said. "One I didn't expect to see again." She opened the folder and held up a yellowed letter, untouched for nearly 5 decades. It was addressed to her. Lucille Jackson, Communications Division, Dana. Sender, Private E. Moss. The envelope had never been opened. Rowan had discovered it, misfiled under a civilian index card, likely deliberately misplaced during the purge. Lucille's hands trembled slightly as she opened it in front of everyone. The handwriting was slanted. Quick, familiar. "Lucille, if you're reading this, it means something went wrong, and I couldn't tell you myself, but I need you to know. I saw the file. I saw what they're planning. They're not just cutting us out, they're hunting anyone who won't stay quiet. I have to run, but I'm leaving clues. If I make it out, I'll find a way back. If not, tell the world we were here." "Here." Lucille's voice broke on the final line. The crowd stood silent, even the wind still. She turned to Elias and Tyrese. "She didn't die in that fire," Lucille whispered. "She ran." Tyrese stepped forward, holding the photograph from the young boy, the one of Ernestine in uniform, dated 1975, signed by hand. "She left more than clues," he said. "She left a trail." Lucille looked up, eyes wide, because etched on the back of the photo in faint, almost invisible ink were coordinates, and beneath them, "Start here." Lucille Jackson sat alone in her hotel room, the envelope trembling slightly in her hand. The letter, recovered days ago from a misfiled archive at Fort Whitmore, had felt like a ghost pressing against her chest. Now, hours before the memorial dedication, she finally let herself open it fully. The handwriting hadn't changed. It was slanted, quick, the way Ernestine always wrote when she was nervous or hiding something. Lucille remembered that handwriting from years ago. Scrawled notes passed during downtime, inside ration boxes, sometimes even across coffee mugs with grease-penciled jokes. But this was different. This was a letter never meant to be found. She unfolded the pages slowly, heart thudding with every crease, as if she might tear it just by breathing too hard. "Lucille, if this reaches you, then something must have gone right. Or maybe everything went wrong. I'm not sure which anymore. I've been watching, not like they think. I mean, I've been watching them, watching what happens when women like us speak too loud, too clearly, too early. They don't silence us with bullets anymore. They do it with files, with erasure, with forgetting. I saw your name come up in a report, not a good one. Flagged. Watched. Disruptive to unit morale, they said. That's how they coded truth. But I also saw you walk into that bunker, every morning, worn boots and defiant heart, and never shrink. You held your head up while men dismissed you, and you made space for me when I didn't even know I deserved it. You were the first person who ever looked at me and didn't see fragility or pity. Just purpose. I need you to know. You gave me the strength to run." Lucille pressed the paper to her chest and closed her eyes. She could still see Ernestine's face, soft, resolute, often quiet, but never weak. A nurse, yes, but also a decoder, a communicator, a woman who had seen things too dark for protocol. She was always listening, even when the world turned the volume down. That morning, Lucille walked to the newly unveiled Memorial of the Silenced. A crowd had gathered, bigger than expected. Thousands filled the lawn of the former base. The stone she'd laid days earlier now stood as the centerpiece of a growing monument. Etched names had been added overnight, retrieved from newly unearthed service files. The Pentagon was now forced to release. Some names were still redacted, but enough had been found to draw history out of hiding. The stage was minimal. A simple podium. 2 microphones. 1 flag. Lucille stepped forward. She wore her uniform again. Every thread of it. A silence settled over the field, not the kind born of awkward waiting, but of reverence. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she unfolded the letter deliberately, gently, and began to read. Lucille, I know what they think of us. That we're emotional. That we crack. That the weight of our color and gender makes us too soft to carry the burden of war. But they never understood what it took to wear this uniform, knowing you were invisible inside it. Lucille's voice cracked. She paused. Breathed deep. The crowd was still. No one moved. Even the children sensed something sacred was happening. They said I died in a fire. But what burned wasn't my body. It was the proof of my service. They wanted us gone, Lucille. But they forgot that some things don't die in flames. They forgot that women like us leave embers. Tears welled in Lucille's eyes, but she kept going. Her voice became stronger, louder. You, Lucille, are one of those embers. You burned bright when the rest of us were being smothered, and even if I'm not there to say it, I want the world to hear it now. You kept me alive. You gave me courage. You made silence impossible. The crowd broke. Muffled sobs. Tissues raised. Arms wrapped around shoulders. Veterans bowed their heads. Teachers wiped tears from their cheeks as students held hands. Lucille folded the letter again, her hands visibly shaking. She looked up from the podium. I don't know where Ernestine ended up. I don't even know if she made it past the border. But I know this. She saw me. She believed me. And she made sure that her words didn't die in that fire. A long pause. And now we remember her. The applause wasn't explosive. It was slow. Rising. Like a tide building into thunder. The sound carried across the base, up through the pine trees that once shaded classified conversations, and out beyond the fence lines that once kept Lucille and Ernestine bound to silence. She stepped back from the podium, tears streaking down her face, but her posture upright, unbroken. Elias approached, gently placing a hand on her back. She was with you, he whispered. Lucille nodded. Always. But just as she turned from the stage, one of the research aides from the Pentagon's newly assembled recovery task force jogged toward her, clutching a tablet. Mrs. Jackson, the aide said, breathless. There's something you need to see. Lucille furrowed her brow. The young woman held out the tablet, screen glowing with a scanned page. It was an internal report dated, marked top secret. Lucille scanned the text until her eyes locked on a line near the bottom. Subjects of concern include Jackson, Lucille M. Moss, Ernestine A. Santiago, U. H. Bruton, S. Intelligence Liaison, compromised. Lucille froze. H. Bruton. She knew that name. Wait, she whispered, eyes narrowing. Is that? Elias leaned over the screen. His face turned to stone. General Stanley Bruton. The one who defended you publicly. The one who demanded your apology. The aide nodded. It gets worse. This file says Bruton knew about the suppression program, and he signed a clearance that buried your entire unit's existence, then retired with full honors. Lucille staggered back slightly, the weight of the realization crushing into her chest. He pretended to be on my side, she murmured. Elias clenched his jaw. He used your resurgence to rewrite his legacy. Lucille looked down at the tablet, her voice calm but lethal. Then it's time we rewrite his history. It began as a murmur, a subtle rustling of recognition rippling through the marble columns of the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. The kind of sound that doesn't come from volume, but reverence. The ceremonial guards at the entrance stiffened to attention. Onlookers craned their necks. The whispers turned into silence as Lucille M. Jackson stepped into the room. She didn't walk fast. She didn't smile. But she walked like someone who no longer had anything to prove and everything to honor. Her uniform, the same worn threads she had once been mocked for, was now preserved exactly as it was. No one dared offer a replacement. It had become something more than fabric. It was a national relic. Today, the nation was giving her its highest civilian honor, the Congressional Gold Medal. The air inside the rotunda was heavy with a history that had finally made room for her. Cameras from across the globe lined the room. Rows of lawmakers, some allies, some latecomers to conscience, sat in suits and uniforms, awaiting the moment. Among them were students holding history books, updated just weeks ago. Pages now inked with Lucille's name. The Speaker of the House stepped forward, voice carrying through the archways. Today we do more than correct the record. We acknowledge that the silence of institutions can be louder than their words, and that it takes extraordinary courage to speak truth into that silence. She gestured to Lucille, seated front and center. Mrs. Lucille Jackson, your life reminds us that valor is not always visible, that history doesn't always write its heroes in real time, but truth has a way of enduring, of rising, of claiming its space. Applause swelled, echoing off the stone like waves in a cathedral. Elias Granger stood nearby, his posture proud. Tyrese, now formally enrolled in a civic leadership program, clutched the edge of his seat, eyes wide. His hoodie bore Lucille's unit patch, stitched in gold thread now, in her honor. Lucille approached the podium when called. She was handed the medal by the speaker, gold round, weighty with meaning, and offered a standing ovation. But she didn't raise it over her head. She held it at her side, then placed it gently on the podium as she began to speak. Her voice was quiet, the kind that made people lean in. I didn't ask for this, she said, but I thank the ones who never stopped asking for me. She looked across the room. For decades, I walked in silence, in my own country, in my own uniform, wearing honor that others tried to strip from me. She paused. But I wasn't the only one. Today I ask not for applause, but for remembrance. She turned to the large screen behind her. A live scroll began to move. One by one, names began to appear. Not in alphabetical order, not ranked by medal or clearance. Just name. A voice read them aloud. Private First Class Byron Santiago. Lieutenant May Yu. Communications Tech Janelle Rhodes. Field Operator Ernestine Moss. Lucille M. Jackson. The list continued for nearly 8 minutes. During that time, no one sat. The audience stood, hands on hearts, heads bowed. Lucille turned back to the crowd. We weren't missing, she said. We were misplaced, erased, buried beneath fear and racism, and rank. Her voice sharpened, but we were never gone. The speaker returned to the podium. In recognition of these veterans and in honor of those yet to be named, we propose the creation of a new federal holiday, Unsung Heroes Day, observed each October 12th. A day to honor service members of color whose names were lost, stolen, or hidden. Let the next generation learn not just what was done, but what was undone. Applause broke out again. This time thunderous, lasting, cathartic. Lucille stepped back to the microphone. One last time. She looked into the nearest camera, into the homes of millions. You laughed at my uniform. She paused. But now the whole world wears my name. The camera zoomed in as the crowd roared. Tears streamed down cheeks. Flags waved in the hands of children. Reporters captured every second. On social media, the quote became immortal. Printed, posted, tattooed. As the ceremony closed, the crowd slowly began to exit, but not before one small moment changed everything again. A child, barely 9 years old, stood near the front. A black girl with round glasses, tight curls, and an oversized blazer that dwarfed her frame. She held up a cardboard sign, written in crayon. Lucille spotted it as she turned to leave. The words were simple. I want to be like Lucille. Lucille stopped walking. She locked eyes with the girl. Slowly, she walked over, kneeling just enough to meet her at eye level. What's your name? Lucille asked, voice soft. Jordan, the girl whispered. Lucille took the girl's hand. You already are. As Lucille rose, a man in a dark suit approached discreetly. He handed her a sealed file. It just arrived from Genoa, Italy, he said. Signed by Ernestine Moss. Ma'am, she's alive. They tried to erase her name, just like they erased thousands before her. But truth doesn't die in silence. It rises. It fights back. If her story moved you, don't let it be forgotten again. Type yes if you believe in justice. Subscribe if this broke your heart.